Hey everybody, it's me. Welcome to the channel, or welcome back. This is the third and final part of a series comparing and contrasting the official Slaves of the Republic comics with their TCW Season 4 adaptation, for the purpose of analyzing the differences in the storytelling and seeing how those differences impact the plot, themes, and characters. Suffice to say, if you care about spoilers for this arc, there will be spoilers. Also, if you want to see additional points, deeper explanations, musings, and other outtakes from this and parts 1 and 2, we are releasing those exclusively on Patreon, so be sure to follow our link in the description to get access. In the previous videos, we covered the first and second episodes of the TV arc and comic issues 1 through 4. And now we're moving on to the last episode and its corresponding comics. Let's get into it. If you recall, the comic side of the story had ended with our heroes split. Ahsoka caged, Obi-Wan and Rex enslaved with the kidnapped Togruta, and Anakin stuck under the Queen's thumb. The episode ended almost exactly the same, although fleshing out each of their predicaments by borrowing from scenes in issue 5 of the comics, which nicely sets up the finale to this arc. The episode opens in the slave processing facility, with the Keeper mocking Kenobi's fall from master to slave. We get a short tour showing the suffering of the people there, and then come back to Obi-Wan, who remarks to Rex about how the terrible conditions are affecting the Togruta. Now, maybe this is a nitpick, but it bugs me that all the occupants of the slave factory are still in their own clothes. I understand that changing all their outfits is a lot of extra work for the animation team, but it's those little things that can make a big difference. How we dress is part of expressing who we are. And in a place like this, where everything is designed to shatter the will, it would make sense for any vestiges of their identities to be stripped away from them. I don't want to rake them over the coals for it, but it's just one more way that the creators of TCW are cutting corners and thus undercutting the impact of their own story. But getting back on topic, a guard overhears Obi-Wan's comment and gives him a shock with the whip, telling him that speaking is forbidden. So Obi-Wan speaks an apology. As per the Keeper's warning at the end of the last episode, the guards begin whipping another slave in order to punish Kenobi. In instinctive reaction, Kenobi tells the guards to stop, which of course only adds to the punishment being given. The guard demands that Kenobi beg him to stop or else he'll beat the slave to death. So Kenobi, looking terribly distraught, quickly humbles himself, bowing to the floor and begging forgiveness. After the guards leave, Kenobi moves to the beaten slave, but they rebuff him, fearfully pointing out that he'll only make things worse. Now, unsurprisingly, Kenobi and Rex's conversation is condensed from what we see in the comic. There, Rex is reporting to Kenobi what he has observed about the security measures in the place, effectively implying that they've been looking for a way to escape. Although Rex is disheartened by what he's found, Obi-Wan maintains his hope and determination. Unfortunately, he's overheard, and the guard immediately whips another slave in order to punish him. Instinctively, Kenobi tells them to leave the slave alone, which of course only adds to the punishment being given. But when the guard threatens to whip the slave to death unless Kenobi begs him to stop, Kenobi gathers his wits and calmly mind tricks the guard, phrasing it in such a way so as to convince the other guards present that he is indeed begging. Once they are alone again, he offers to help the beaten slave off the floor, but they rebuff him and scamper away. Similar to the auction, I find TCW Obi-Wan to be pitiful compared to the comic Obi-Wan. Certainly he still has his Jedi selflessness and compassion, but his spirit is broken. His strength of character, his cleverness, it's all gone. And it doesn't make sense why the creators chose to present him this way. They have the time, they're just not utilizing it well. And what makes it worse is that it doesn't seem to be an intentional thematic choice, since they don't go anywhere with it, which we'll see later. But for now, Dooku is approaching Zygerria in conversation with Palpatine. In the comic, their discussion focuses on the problems the Zygerrian Queen is creating by advertising that the Separatists are enslaving their prisoners of war. Of course, upon hearing such news, many neutral systems are rushing to join the Republic before it happens to them as well. So Sidious orders Dooku to get the Queen to fall in line or else end her. In TCW, Sidious is more concerned with getting enough slaves to uphold Sith tradition. Tradition! And he worries the Queen is getting in the way of this goal.
I assure you the Queen's defiance will not sour your plans, Master.
If she fails to see the error of her ways, end her rule.
So, as I mentioned in the last video, there's a scene from the comic right after the auction where Dooku confronts the Queen and orders her to kill the captured Jedi, which is why when Anakin wakes up, the Queen tells him Dooku is demanding your death. That line was preserved in the last episode, but the scene which provided the context for that line was intended to be part of this episode. Presumably before this exchange between Dooku and Sidious, but that detail is moot since the scene ended up being completely cut. Thus leaving very little context for us to understand why Dooku and Sidious think that the Queen might be going rogue and jeopardizing their goals. Technically, having the Queen's passing comment about Dooku demanding Anakin's execution after the auction provides enough for us to understand this otherwise extremely vague exchange between our lead villains. But I also think it's fair to say that it's created a weak spot in the story. It's not a plot hole, it's just a blink and you miss it and end up confused later kind of thing. And that's watching now. Imagine watching it when it was airing and you had an entire week to forget that detail before you see this scene. It's one of those situations where the creators really seem to be relying on the audience to fill in the gaps, which, to be clear, isn't inherently bad, but when the audience is accepting things based solely or very heavily on their own assumptions rather than their knowledge of the content, then it's crossed a line. Before we move on, I may as well acknowledge the Night Sister who is absent from the TV adaptation. Obviously, since Ventress was betrayed and abandoned by Dooku in Season 3, Episode 12, it wouldn't make sense for her to suddenly be back at his side. Certainly, in the first 3 seasons, there hadn't been much bother made about chronology, but Filoni had promised fans that TCW would not jump around the timeline like that anymore. So Ventress had to go. Fortunately, since she did not have too significant a role in the comic, her exclusion here helps cut down on episode runtime without losing too much else in the process. Anyway, as I mentioned in the last video, due to how the adaptation juggled around the scenes, there are a few interactions from the comic which got split up over 2 scenes in the TV version. In the comic, after Anakin helps protect the Queen during a payment delivery gone sideways, her advisor reports that Count Dooku is on his way, very upset that the Jedi still live. Anakin comments on how even she has a master, and that leads into their conversation about what is and isn't slavery, the latter of which was included in the last episode, but obviously without that lead up. The conversation ultimately ended with Anakin and the Queen discussing a deal wherein if he promises to submit himself to her, she will free his friends. He's left to think it over, but the two of them never get a chance to revisit the contract before Dooku's arrival. However, in TCW, there's an episode break right after they discuss making a deal. So now when we rejoin Anakin and the Queen, the creators reestablish where we're at by having her ask him if he's thought more about her offer. When he responds that it's not an easy decision, she remarks,
I thought the Jedi were selfless, placing the needs of others before their own.
Is she trying to guilt trip him into accepting the deal? In the last episode, she noted that he's
a most curious Jedi who cares more about his friends and his own mission.
Which is to say, he cares more about what's important to him than he does about the Jedi Code. And she knows that, so her now throwing the values of the Jedi at him in an attempt to guilt trip doesn't quite add up. But soon after, the Prime Minister comes with his report of Dooku's imminent arrival, and then Anakin gets to make his comment about her having a master. But that line doesn't contribute as much here since it doesn't go anywhere. After denying Anakin's observation, the Queen just decides it'd be better if he didn't attend this meeting with Dooku, and she takes his lightsaber to prevent him from running away while she's gone. Even though that doesn't make sense because it's not her presence that's keeping him in check, it's her power over his friends' lives, which doesn't change when she's away. Not to mention, he's a Jedi. He doesn't need his lightsaber to get away from the guards, he has the Force. But since Anakin is unarmed and thus helpless to deal with 2 guards, the creators have R2-D2 come to the rescue. Luckily, the guards are laughably incompetent, so it's no trouble.
Get off, you miserable tin can! Get down there and find that Jedi.
Yes, sir.
On top of that, R2 also knows where Ahsoka is, so he leads Anakin away to find her. In the comic, Anakin needs no rescue, as the Queen is completely confident in the power she has over him and just leaves him unattended when she goes to meet Dooku. He uses this opportunity to go searching for his Padawan, using his Jedi senses to guide him. Meanwhile, Dooku and the Queen have their meeting. When the Queen pretends to be surprised by his visit, Dooku reveals that the Prime Minister invited him, apparently due to concerns over the Queen's attachment to Anakin. In the comic, the Queen asserts that Anakin is her property, a symbol of Zygerria's power to enslave even Jedi. In TCW, the Queen trips over herself, claiming his symbolism as her own before correcting to our, presumably to include Dooku. And while not inherently a bad change since it makes her more diplomatic and shows Dooku does have influence over her, I do find it a bit at odds with her characteristic narcissism, which puts herself and Zygerria at the top of the totem pole. Continuing on, Dooku warns her that her power over Anakin is an illusion. He knows this because he understands Jedi. He was one after all. The Queen scoffs at the notion that Anakin is similar to Dooku and attempts to inspire him with her goals for the Jedi. In the comic, she expounds on what she said at the auction about the Jedi's greatest weakness. She explains how Kenobi's compassion will be what breaks him, since he wants to help the other slaves around him, and in his situation, the best thing he can do for their benefit is to submit. During her monologue, we see Kenobi obediently going through his day with a grim expression. In TCW, she says effectively the same thing, the major differences being, 1, she asks Dooku to hear her out, rather than simply presenting her case. 2, Dooku actually seems interested in what she has to say, even though afterward he reveals that it doesn't matter to him at all.
Obi-Wan Kenobi is in despair.
I'm listening.
A few moments later.
My goal is not the enslavement of the Jedi Order, but its extermination.
And 3, during the Queen's voiceover, we see a guard try to provoke Obi-Wan into a fight, and it almost works, but Kenobi ends up backing down. The issue for me here is that A, Obi-Wan's initial attitude is very "how dare you," which feels a little out of character for him. And B, in that standoff, there are no other slaves visible or being threatened, so it feels more like Obi-Wan backs down to save himself from whipping than anyone else. Anyway, the Queen wraps up her speech with the optimism that if the likes of Skywalker and Kenobi can be tamed, then they could eventually have an army of Jedi slaves. In the comic, the Queen names this army as her own before asserting that it will make Zygerria invincible. In TCW, she pitches the concept as Dooku's army before asserting that Zygerria will be invincible. It's a small change that makes a small difference, but it's just one more thing that doesn't really make sense. When she's done speaking, Dooku reveals that he has no interest in her goals. He's there to supervise or else perform the execution of the Jedi. No ifs, ands, or buts. In the comic, the scene continues into an altercation, which we'll get to later. But in TCW, the camera cuts away after he orders her to summon Anakin. Because in the TV version, Anakin still needs to reunite with Ahsoka, something he'd already done by this point in the comic version. After the camera lingers on a close-up of Ahsoka's bare thigh, a dynamic angle for catching Anakin and R2's approach, which could have easily been altered to avoid the pin-up shot of an underage girl. Her response to his arrival is the typical banter. Instead of a "good to see you" or an "I knew you'd come," we get a derisive
"took you long enough."
And if I haven't already been clear enough about this, the issue isn't the sarcastic dig itself. It's the fact that the writers predominantly use this method to portray friends interacting. Most of what we see is them verbally backhanding each other, as if that's the default way friends communicate affection. Reminder, this is a show targeted at children. And in my opinion, in that context, it is irresponsible to frame people who mainly put each other down as good friends. But I digress. After bantering back that his tardiness was because he knew she had a good view, he force lifts her cage up onto the balcony and pulls it open. In a rare moment of actually showing friendly care and consideration, he takes her hand and gently asks if she's okay. And she just kind of ignores the question, which effectively undercuts the actually friendly moment.
Are you okay?
I sense a disturbance in the Force.
If you recall, in the comic, this scene starts with Ahsoka talking to the captain of the guard, calmly informing him that she's not actually trapped. She could have escaped at any moment, but she was waiting for Anakin. Going back to what I talked about in the last video, how comic Ahsoka is actually treated much more respectfully by the narrative than TCW Ahsoka, please note that the clear basis of this reunion is not Ahsoka needing Anakin, but rather him needing her. Ahsoka isn't waiting for rescue, she's waiting to receive her marching orders. She's being a team player, she's showing patience, respect for her master, maturity, etc. We're not shown her release from the cage, we just see Anakin threatening the captain in one panel, and then in the next, he's in the cage instead of Ahsoka. But once she's out, she does banter with Anakin, making a pun about her situation. He makes his crack about the good view, but sincerely asks if she's okay. Lo and behold, she actually gives a direct response before mentioning that she is sensing the presence of their enemies through the Force. Before we move on, I want to point out a bit of a problem in the TCW version. See what Ahsoka does here? Now certainly, this does a good job of clearly showing, instead of telling like in the comic, that Ahsoka was able to free herself from the collar at any time. So why didn't she? And before you say, well duh, she was waiting for Anakin, let me finish my question. Why didn't she take it off back at the auction before threatening the Queen? She had time after taking out the guards. This whole thing could have been avoided. This small action creates a big plot hole. And I'll just clarify that in the comic, we never see any of the Jedi pull their shock collars off, so this is not a plot hole in that version. In the comic, Anakin confirms Dooku and Ventress's presence and tasks Ahsoka with finding transportation for them to escape. She assumes he's going to fight the two Darksiders and insists he needs her help with that. But he assures her that's not his plan. He's only going to find out Obi-Wan's location from the Queen, and then he'll signal her. Though he pauses to say that if she doesn't hear from him, she is to leave with R2 and never return. She makes a sarcastic quip about how reassuring that sounds, but then sincerely sends him off with good luck, which he thanks her for. Then she quickly sets about completing the task he's given her. In TCW, after Anakin informs her that Dooku is there, he says he needs her to get their ship and passes her a comlink. When he starts to leave, she demands to know,
"Where are you going?"
Just like in the first episode of this arc, Ahsoka has this tone like she's acting as his babysitter, which is incredibly disrespectful. He simply responds that the Queen knows where Obi-Wan is and she's to wait for his signal. Then he leaves, and once he's away, we can tell she's annoyed at him.
"Come on, R2.
And that's the end of the scene. Do you see the difference here? Do you see what I mean about how in the comic, we see a friendship, we see teamwork, but in TCW, we see red flags and begrudging submission? Have I beaten this horse dead enough? In the comic, both characters are given dignity, but in TCW, both characters are undercut by poor directing decisions. If you read the exchange, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But when you add in the body language animation, the tone in the voice acting, the broader context of narrative framing, all which is overseen by the supervising director, then you see how a perfectly serviceable exchange in the script becomes problematic through execution. But either way, with Ahsoka freed, we then see the rest of Dooku's meeting with the Queen. If you recall, Dooku had just ordered the Queen to summon Skywalker for execution. Now as we return, the Queen tries to weasel out of it, claiming Anakin is a valuable asset to her and her throne. When Dooku points out that the Jedi's execution was not a request, she snaps.
I will not be ordered about in my own palace, Count.
In response to this, Dooku pivots, suggesting that if she is incompliant, perhaps her Prime Minister will follow orders. When the Queen asks him what Dooku means, the Prime Minister admits he agrees with Dooku, the Jedi should die. And he adds sternly that she's unfit to be Queen. Infuriated by this twist, the Queen pulls out her own whip, vowing to make them both pay for their treachery. But her bid for domination ends immediately as Dooku begins force choking her, calling it
punishment for a slave who disobeys her master.
I guess the creators really wanted to make sure the audience caught on to their theme there. In the comic, as I mentioned, the scene is not split. So Dooku never actually orders the Queen to summon Anakin. Right after he clarifies that he's there to either supervise or perform the execution of the Jedi, she puts her foot down and asserts her rights as a member of the Separatist Council. Her advisor begs her to reconsider this defiance, but she refuses. At which point Dooku pulls his lightsaber and tells her he is relieving her of her position on the council. The Queen is outraged at him drawing a weapon on her in her throne room and orders her guards to arrest him. Dooku calmly and easily throws them aside with the Force. As he comes toward her, she firmly asserts that the Separatists need her. He needs her. To which he remarks that he already has a more compliant successor lined up. By way of admittance, the advisor comments that she's brought this on herself. When she deduces that they plan to murder her, Dooku reveals that Anakin will be framed for the deed. And it's after he's already begun squeezing her throat with the Force, she defiantly chokes out that he will pay for this treachery. I know I've mentioned already that the presentation of the Queen in TCW is done rather well. It comes quite close to her comic version. But this is one of those scenes where I feel something was lost in adaptation. The Queen in the comics has such an unwavering personality. Throughout her time across the pages, she has such a strong sense of self. She believes so completely in her status and power, she bows to no one. But in TCW, this scene, taken as a whole, has all these little moments where she defers to Dooku, including how she tries to politely decline Anakin's execution rather than immediately refusing. And as an aside, it's kinda silly in my opinion that she only gets angry about being ordered around when Dooku blatantly words his directives as such.
Summon Skywalker.
12 seconds later.
I command you to kill Skywalker.
I will not be ordered about in my own palace, Count.
And then to top it all off, she's so thoroughly silenced when she finally tries to assert herself. Even though it's just small changes, it takes her so far from her characterization in the comics, where she's still so poised and bold, even as she's being strangled. As I've said before, it's not that TCW's version is bad, it's just I love her comic version. And comic Anakin, arriving on the scene, doesn't hesitate. The woman who holds the key to his friend's whereabouts is on the brink of death, and he's got the drop on Dooku. He throws the Sith aside with the Force and rushes to the Queen, immediately asking her where the others are. Compare this to TCW, where he makes a loud grand entrance and then scolds the Sith Lord into releasing the Queen.
It's enough, Dooku!
Because this approach leaves Dooku as a threat, Anakin now has to dance around him instead of being able to get the info he needs from the dying Queen. Dooku threatens to end her life if Anakin comes any closer, and Anakin lies to deflect attention away from her. Dooku buys the bluff, leaving the Queen alone, and the two of them fight. In the comic, while Dooku is incapacitated, the Queen gives Anakin the information he needs and then dies. The fight is provoked by the arrival of Ventress, who makes a very biting remark that for him may be a harsh callback to his mother's demise, and also for the audience, foreshadowing. As he duels her, a torch is knocked over and the palace begins to burn. Then Dooku pulls himself together and the fight quickly becomes 2 against 1. Between the burning backdrop and Anakin holding the two of them off with his own lightsaber and one stolen from Ventress, it's a fight I would have loved to see brought to animation, but alas. Although he's putting up good competition, Anakin wisely retreats, shattering a large window with the Force before diving out of it, and landing on Dooku's ship, which is being piloted by Anakin's clever Padawan. In TCW, Anakin's fight with only Dooku doesn't go anywhere near as well. His torture is ended when the conspicuously absent palace guards serendipitously arrive. Dooku announces that Anakin murdered the Queen, who is still moving, and instead of just finishing Anakin off himself, Dooku encourages the guards to
take your vengeance,
which gives Anakin the chance to escape, after signaling Ahsoka to pick him up.
That's our signal. Let's get going.
If you felt like that scene was a bit dragged out, you're not alone. They could have cut away from that much sooner than they did. Also, and this is totally a nitpick, but I find it hilarious that the Queen's martini glass, which she smashed, is seen lying next to her in mint condition when Anakin picks her up. Lucky for Anakin, the guards focus on shooting out the window for him so he can leap through and land on the ship his Padawan has brought on cue. After gently laying the Queen down in the cargo hold, of course the first thing out of his mouth is the question of where Obi-Wan—
Your Highness.
Okay, never mind. I mean, obviously he does ask her a moment later, but I just find it odd that his whole rescue of her, and even now the aftermath, is structured in such a way that he doesn't ask her as soon as possible. It just makes it feel like getting the information isn't all that urgent to Anakin, which it should be. As you might expect, there are some differences between the alternate versions of the Queen's death scene. In the comic, she correctly guesses that the reason Anakin took so long to arrive was because he was freeing his Padawan, so she gives him Ahsoka's lightsaber. In TCW, it's his own lightsaber that she returns to him. And later, Ahsoka simply has her own sabers again, somehow. Also in the comic, the Queen admits to having a master, though she denies it's Dooku, instead asserting that it's her heart. In TCW, she admits to being a slave like Anakin. To be honest, I have no problem with the TV adaptation reducing her blatant romantic infatuation with him. It's not completely gone, it is hinted at. But connected to what I mentioned earlier, I don't like having her admit to being a slave. In my opinion, it diminishes her characterization. Like Anakin says in the comic, there is an extent to where slavery is a state of mind. The Queen in the comic went to her grave as her own master. The Queen in TCW died a slave. Of course, I do think that the theme of the Queen being a slave herself is a great inclusion. And while it's present in both versions, one could argue that the slight differences made to her TCW characterization actually show that theme a little better. Honestly, I'm torn. Probably because I do so love her comic version. But I will point out that it's somewhat annoying how TCW seems to have no faith in its audience's intelligence and repeatedly, explicitly beats us over the head with this theme.
So even you have a master.
Punishment for a slave who disobeys her master.
I am a slave.
Thanks, I think we get it now, for pity's sake. The comic issue ends with Dooku sending Ventress to destroy the facility on Kadavo, because if the people of Kyros are freed, his little white lie about them all being destroyed by the Jedi is going to be exposed. And although that's the last we see of him in this story, his exit is punctuated with ruthlessness befitting a Sith Lord, building tension that will pay off in the final showdown. The episode, meanwhile, with 11 minutes left on the clock, jumps straight to Kadavo, where we're shown a cell containing a bunch of Togruta before we're taken to the security tower where Obi-Wan and Rex have just been escorted. They're prodded to their knees on the floor before the Keeper, and he informs them that Dooku wishes to speak to them. To be precise, Dooku wants to gloat. Now, allow me to put that scene on pause for a moment, because we're missing something from the comic here. See, issue 6 opens with Obi-Wan and Rex overhearing a heartbreaking conversation. One Togruta is confiding to another that he feels his life isn't worth clinging to anymore, as they've lost everything. Obi-Wan is still confident that they will eventually be freed, but he's worried the people will be too broken by that point. They need something to hold on to see them through to the other side. So he and Rex share with the Togruta that Kyros, their home, was liberated and it awaits their return. The Togruta are inspired to revolt right away, but he warns them of how many would perish and encourages them to just hang in there, to toil diligently until a better opportunity presents itself. The Keeper quickly notices the change among the slaves, the passive defiance that comes from hope, as he calls it. And it is for this reason that Obi-Wan and Rex are brought to the security tower, because the Keeper knows they must be behind this quiet revolution. As usual, I understand why the creators made this change, but I think it's a real shame that this was lost to the cutting room floor, especially since what the creators came up with to replace it just makes Count Dooku into even more of a mustache-twirling cartoon villain. In the comic, the Keeper remarks how he's been trying to contact contact the Queen in order to get permission to destroy them since they're so troublesome, but to no avail. And then a transport ship arrives. The Keeper assumes that the Queen is delivering the rest of the Jedi to him in chains. But when the doors open, out come the cavalry. While the clones deal with the droids stationed outside, Anakin and Ahsoka rush to the facility. Anakin starts cutting through the blast doors, and Ahsoka quickly joins in the effort. In TCW, the cavalry that arrives is just Anakin and Ahsoka. Luckily, there are no actual guards to hinder their advance. The only security measures in place are some fixed turrets, which conveniently our heroes can take cover from right at the doors where they need to stand while trying to get inside. Which Anakin does, while Ahsoka stands there and does nothing. It's amazing how her characterization truly shines in these moments. We can clearly see this version of Ahsoka is a real go-getter, a team player, really chomping at the bit to help her people. Such a great character. Meanwhile, inside the facility, in the comic, Obi-Wan quickly suggests that the Keeper surrender in the interest of saving lives. But the Keeper instead uses the slaves as hostages, threatening to dump them into the fiery abyss below if Anakin doesn't stop. So Obi-Wan naturally steps into his role as the negotiator and gets on the intercom to speak with Anakin. In TCW, it is Dooku who spurs Obi-Wan into action, ordering him to tell Anakin to stop or else the slaves will be terminated. And that is why Obi-Wan gets on the intercom to speak with Anakin. I know I've said it before, but it is so disappointing to see Obi-Wan's character diminished like this. I'd also like to point out that after this, although we see Dooku's holo projection in the background a couple more times, he has no more lines, and between cuts he just quietly disappears, like completely, from the story. And to me, it just adds to what makes Dooku feel like a non-threat. The fact that he's just shuffled off stage while we're distracted. He's narratively ignored during the climax of the arc when he's supposed to be one of the major antagonists of the series. Such a lackluster exit, just does not sit right with me, but moving on. Unsurprisingly, in both versions, Anakin refuses to negotiate with the slavers. In the comic, Ahsoka questions his decision, to which he responds with a reassurance that they will rescue everyone. Shortly thereafter, as he continues to rebuff Obi-Wan's advice, she again respectfully throws in her 2 cents. But the conversation is interrupted at that point because the Separatist forces arrive. The fleet which accompanied Anakin tries to slow them down, but Ventress manages to pierce through the interference and heads down to the surface with a squad of bombers at her side. In TCW, Ahsoka is still acting like Harry Potter,
Making no noise and pretending that I don't exist.
and so Obi-Wan is used to set up Anakin for a witty one-liner that reveals he does have reinforcements, which are only a fraction of what they had in the comics. But speaking of reinforcements, when Plo Koon enters the fight, suddenly there are Zygerrian guards outside who begin shooting at him in the wolf pack. Where did they come from? No, seriously, where did they come from? And why didn't they go attack Anakin? Why don't they go attack Anakin? I doubt their blasters will be very effective against the wolf pack. On that note, Ahsoka, still standing idly beside Anakin, makes a comment which prompts this delightful exchange.
I hope you told Master Plo not to destroy this facility before we get off of it.
Yeah, all of us and the slaves.
We'll need a bigger ship.
First, it bothers me that Ahsoka apparently thinks that Plo Koon needs to be told not to turn them into collateral damage. Again, these backhanded remarks, which are meant to be friendly ribbing, don't work as intended when it's all we ever really hear from one friend to or about another. Second, was Ahsoka not aware that their plan was to rescue all the slaves? Her people? Did she just think they were there for Obi-Wan? My guess is that it's a tribute to Jaws.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
But you cannot just throw a line like that into a character's mouth and pretend that it holds no meaning in context of the story currently being told, or that it has no effect on characterization. It does! And on the topic of weird dialogue, when the transport they arrived on got destroyed earlier, Anakin remarked,
So much for our ride home.
which doesn't quite add up because he was already expecting reinforcements. So it seems seems like a cheap one-liner meant to mislead the audience for the sake of the dramatic reveal, rather than something that his character would actually say in that situation. While the showdown in TCW starts with the arrival of Republic reinforcements, it begins in the comic with the arrival of Separatist forces, led jointly by Grievous and Ventress. As the Keeper points out, between the droids coming seemingly to aid them and the Togruta lives on the line, Anakin has no choice but to cease his attack on the facility. And so finally he does. The Keeper expects the arriving bombers to target Anakin, but then they destroy one of the facility supports. Anakin quickly fills him in on the situation, revealing that Dooku wants the whole operation wiped out to hide his involvement. In the hopes of appeasing Dooku and saving his own skin, the Keeper decides to go ahead and purge all the slaves. But Obi-Wan and Rex spring into action, taking out both the Keeper and the guards. Shortly thereafter, the clones manage to stop the Separatist bombers, driving Ventress away. While Ahsoka momentarily regrets not being able to chase the assassin, Anakin reminds her that they still have an important mission in progress, to which she banters back about having to save Obi-Wan. Which is a perfect example of how these moments are not inherently bad. The issue in TCW is how redundant and consistently negative they are. Speaking of TCW, once Anakin finishes cutting through the blast door, he and Ahsoka enter the facility, wherein they are immediately beset upon by guards firing their blasters. Although Ahsoka draws her weapon, she apparently, again, stands by and does nothing, while Anakin neutralizes the threat. And then when he's finished, she shakes her head at him judgmentally. Yes, I realize he was clearly killing them in anger, but he was also clearly acting in self-defense. And this is effectively her acting like a babysitter again. She's looking down on him and non-verbally scolding him. It's certainly a far cry from her comic version respectfully voicing her concerns with his decisions. Ultimately, the moment is so brief that it can't actually deal with the weight of what it's addressing. So all that's really happening here is that the narrative is using Ahsoka to tell us that we should view Anakin's behavior as bad. End scene, move on. Meanwhile, once the Wolfpack started taking shots at the facility, thus distracting and unnerving the Zygerrians, Obi-Wan sprang into action, using the Force to tear off his and Rex's shock collars and attacking the guards nearest them. However, choosing to focus solely on the guards leaves the Keeper free to follow through on the threat to exterminate the Togruta. And when Obi-Wan finally realizes what the Keeper is doing, the best response he can muster is,
No!
wow, that was really effective. Too bad he doesn't have some kind of ranged ability that could force the Keeper away from the controls. Especially since he's not even done the worst part yet. See, that button just electrified the walls of the cells. What he does next is open the floors of the cells so that the Togruta will fall into oblivion, and then he damages the controls so that the program cannot be stopped. Not to mention, it also prevents the good guys from disabling the shields on the turrets, which need to be destroyed before the Republic cruiser can fly in to evacuate everyone. Bummer. If only Obi-Wan could have intervened from across the room. And that's not the only questionable aspect of this conflict. There are at least 6 Zygerrian guards in the room before Obi-Wan and Rex begin fighting, 4 behind them and 2 stationed at security screens on either side of the room. The latter 2 apparently disappear. Of the 4 behind them, Kenobi takes out his first one right away and then spends the rest of his time trying to deal with the second, until the Keeper is done wreaking havoc, and then Kenobi immediately finishes his fight. Rex takes a while trying to get rid of his first one, while the second just patiently waits in the corner for his turn. You can catch brief glimpses of him, but he's not doing anything until Rex is fighting him. Once those 4 are all taken out, then 2 more, only 2 more, arrive, but they're easily dealt with. Oh, hey, look at that! It's really frustrating that the creators of TCW make these scenarios which could be easily resolved, or at least improved, if the Jedi would just use the Force, but they don't. And then the creators unintentionally highlight how quick and easy the resolution could have been by having the Jedi use the Force to make something else simpler. To be honest, in general, it is pitiful how infrequently the Force is used in TCW. Over the course of these 3 episodes, you can basically count on your hands the number of times the Jedi have actively used the Force. It's their greatest advantage and a big part of what makes Jedi so cool to watch, and yet yet TCW hardly utilizes it. But I digress. In the comic, the whole tower altercation is contained within a single page. Kenobi prioritizes stopping the Keeper from reaching the controls, Rex takes out the guards, Kenobi uses the Force to immobilize the Keeper and retrieve his lightsaber, done. The controls do get damaged, but it's because of the Separatists bombing the tower, not because Obi-Wan had his intelligence and abilities nerfed. In TCW, the altercation ends with Rex killing the Keeper, because Obi-Wan, as a Jedi, won't kill an unarmed opponent.
I know a Jedi won't kill an unarmed man.
I'm no Jedi.
Honestly, I'm a bit torn over this moment. On the one hand, Kenobi here is being a good Jedi. Despite his anger toward the Keeper, he restrains himself. But on the other hand, he just allows, if not tacitly requests Rex to do it for him. His hands are only technically clean. I cannot deny that seeing the Keeper get his just desserts is more satisfying than the comic version, wherein he is kept alive and brought to justice. But it's still disappointing to see how the TV adaptation continues to undercut Obi-Wan's character in these moments. And what I gather from the featurette, that bit was Filoni's inclusion.
There's Rex killing someone by throwing a spear through them.
That's right.
Was that in the script?
Gosh, you know what? I can't remember if that was in the script.
No.
I don't think so.
No.
I think the chair ended up going into the...
Because I added that line. I'm no Jedi. That's the whole thing.
But let's move on to how each version handles the evacuation of the Togruta. In the comic, as I mentioned earlier, Ventress had been driven back after Anakin and his men had fended off her bombers. She tried asking Grievous for more, but by then Republic reinforcements had arrived and so he retreated. Meanwhile, Ahsoka and Anakin rushed to save Obi-Wan, but quickly discovered that Obi-Wan doesn't need saving. However, he does need their help to enact his plan to get the endangered Togruta to safety. Even though in this version, the damaged controls stopped the cell floors from retracting, there are still some Togruta at risk of falling because the facility was knocked askew when the Separatists bombed it. So Obi-Wan suggests they use the ship Anakin and company arrived in, fly under the facility, and use the Force together to catch those Togruta. However, it's then that Ventress returns, attacking them with her ship. They do their best to fight her off, but to no avail. Just when they seem to have lost, Plo Koon and his team arrive and chase her away. With the Separatists gone, there is no imminent threat to the facility and its occupants, so the Republic can move in and thoroughly evacuate. A process that takes 4 rotations, obviously time skipped. The point is that it's clear everyone was taken care of. As a bit of a side note here, admittedly, Plo Koon's inclusion in the comic feels a lot like a pointless cameo. He literally appears in only one panel. It's so brief, without any setup or payoff. And while his contributions are helpful, you could insert anyone into that role and nothing would change. So why did the writer choose Plo Koon?
I put Plo Koon into the story because I knew that Dave would have to make this into the show.
I know Gilroy is kind of joking there, but at the same time...
Is he though?
Even George Lucas has been known to throw a bone to Filoni to make him happy.
We did a Godzilla episode because you know I like Godzilla. You threw that little bone in there for me, so that was really fun.
So it wouldn't surprise me if Gilroy wrote Plo Koon into the comic just to humor Filoni. Because of Gilroy's comment in the featurette, Filoni goes on a tangent about the Wolfpack and his designs for over a minute until Killian Plunkett quietly points out,
"We're talking about stuff that
has nothing
audiences are going to see for..."
But Filoni continues for another half minute before finally getting back on topic. Not surprisingly, in TCW, Plo Koon and the Wolfpack have much more screen time, which prevents their inclusion from feeling like a pointless cameo. But their role, their impact, is actually lessened. They don't divert an attack on our main heroes, instead troops materialize solely to engage them and no one else. And they don't contribute much of anything to the mission. Anakin still must go out of his way to clear a path for the evacuation cruiser. So, in essence, Plo Koon and his men are even more so just there as a hollow indulgence. But continuing on, I wanted to point out this moment here.
I cannot move the cruiser in for the rescue operation until those enemy cannons are destroyed.
We'll take care of those cannons. Just make sure that cruiser gets down here. We are running out of time.
I'm gonna go help my people. I'll see if I can buy us some time.
It's one of those exchanges which is fine in a vacuum. It can be viewed as two peers who work well together. One volunteers them as a team for a particular task, the other communicates their choice to approach the problem from another angle, and they split up. Still working as a team, but separately. The issue is that this is not a moment in a vacuum. So what we really have here is Ahsoka again putting herself equal to or over Anakin as opposed to respecting his leadership. She doesn't ask or suggest that she approach the problem differently and wait for his authorization. She simply tells him she's doing something else and leaves. He does support her decision, wishing her luck.
Good luck.
But she's already splitting off from him before he gives that approval. And going back to something I pointed out earlier, a couple minutes ago in this episode, Ahsoka seemed to only just come to the realization that they were there to help everyone.
We'll need a bigger ship.
And now suddenly she's heartwarmingly looking out for her people.
I'm gonna go help my people.
Call it nitpicking if you want, but stories are not made up of moments in a vacuum. The choices you make in one area affect other areas. That's just how it works. Anyway, after somehow finding her way to the cell, Ahsoka somehow knows exactly how to operate the Zygerrian system to open the cell door. But she doesn't think to just use that working control panel to reverse the electrified walls and open floor. Instead, she immediately leaps the gap and looks around. I spoke about this at the end of part 2, but this is another example of a missed opportunity to characterize Ahsoka as actually being a caring and compassionate person. When she comes into the cell, she basically just ignores the frightened people, not giving a single word of reassurance or even acknowledgement.
A Jedi!
And keep in mind that this is literally the first time in this version that she is finally coming face to face with her people. I get that time is of the essence, but the creators have control here, so my point still stands. By making her act so aloof, her intended characterization, including her connection to her people, falls flat. Meanwhile, Anakin quickly takes out the turrets and gives Plo Koon the green light to bring in the cruiser for evacuation.
We're all clear, Master Plo. Bring the cruiser down to the landing pad.
However, Ahsoka interjects.
Cancel that order, Master.
I'll point out that wasn't a request, that was her giving him an order, again putting herself above him. And the narrative reinforces this. After she finishes explaining her plan, which I'll remind you was Obi-Wan's in the comic, Admiral Coburn doesn't wait for Anakin to rescind and reissue orders, rather he immediately follows Ahsoka's instructions, effectively treating her as superior to Anakin.
We can escape onto the ship if Admiral Coburn can get in close enough.
You heard Commander Tano. I want the men topside with rocket packs and cable guns. Move it!
They fly now! They fly now! They fly now!
Sorry, not sorry. Once the troopers secure some lines for the Togruta to climb down on, Ahsoka finally addresses the prisoners, ushering them forward in an orderly fashion and paying very little attention to them as they struggle to reach the lines that get further and further away from them as the floor continues to retract. Suddenly, a Togruta woman falls, and Ahsoka leaps after her, passing her in the air and landing below in time to catch her. One, this is clearly yet another case of the creators showboating Ahsoka, and it's really forced. They literally make her neglectful so that she can appear heroic. Two, the way Ahsoka jumped down would not have enabled her to fall that much faster than the Togruta. And don't try to tell me that she used the Force to augment gravitational pull. It shouldn't have worked. And three, the way Ahsoka catches the woman makes it seem like she has no weight. It could be intentional, trying to imply she's using the Force to make herself super duper strong, or it's just bad animation. My guess is the latter. In any case, a couple more Togruta end up falling and are caught and carried down by the flying clone troopers, after which one of them reports to Ahsoka.
That's everyone. We have to go. The facility's breaking up.
Although when we see a full shot of the facility a moment later, it looks perfectly stable. And as soon as the cruiser is clear, Anakin signals Plo Koon and he and his men destroy the facility, with all the Zygerrians still in it.
All gunships, fire!
I don't know about you, but to my understanding, that's not really the Jedi way. They quite literally are doing exactly what Dooku was trying to do in the comics. A mass slaughtering that wipes the slate clean. No opportunity for surrender, nothing. And I'll point out that it wasn't even necessary, in the sense that it didn't need to be destroyed right at that moment. The facility posed no threat to them. Technically, neither did its occupants. With their leader gone, their defenses down, the Republic in control, and no separatist allies to rely on for reinforcements, they'd likely surrender. Our heroes could have taken the time to evacuate it and then destroy it, like they do in the comics, which I'll get back to later. But they choose to end the life of every single person in that facility. Which brings me to the worst part of this. The reality is, only one cell was evacuated. There is nothing shown to indicate any other prisoners being released. And if I'm being really generous, there was, at most, 30 Togruta shown in that cell. But even if I pretend that the other Togruta magically warped out of their cells onto the ship, we still have a problem. Now, normally I don't go too deep into the world building because Star Wars is an ocean of it, and that's too much scope for my videos. But if you recall from part 2, when I was wondering about why TCW altered the number of Togruta in the last episode, I thought maybe the changes made to this evacuation necessitated a smaller number since they were only having one ship get everyone off in a hurry. So I asked on our server for some help in figuring out which ship was used, and someone pointed me to the Architans class light cruiser, and Wikipedia confirmed that was the ship used here. And then I discovered a big problem. That class of light cruiser only carries 100 passengers, not 100,000, 100. Even if we take into account the cargo capacity of 1,200 metric tons, the most this ship could carry, assuming it was carrying nothing else when it arrived, is about 18,000 Togruta. So what happened to the other 32,000?
Awkward.
Maybe I was a bit too hard on Ahsoka when she said they'd need a bigger ship. Actually, in the deleted scene I mentioned earlier between the Queen and Dooku, the dialogue seems to suggest that the reason the sale number on the Togruta is lower in the TV adaptation is because it's only the Queen's share of the capture.
There was nothing in our deal to prevent me from selling my share.
Which begs the question, where are the rest of the Kyros Togruta? Obviously, the narrative implication is that all the kidnapped people were in that facility on Kadavo, which means that the number of people needing to get on that light cruiser exceeded 50,000. Now, I'm sure some people will consider this nitpicking, and as far as the ship's capacity goes, I won't argue that. Because, yeah, unless you're digging through Wikipedia, you'd never know. And the deleted scene was, well, deleted, so it is fair to consider that information moot. But it doesn't eliminate the problem that we are told there are 50,000 people in danger, and we are shown only about 30 of them getting rescued. I expect some of you may be wondering, what's the big deal? The clone told Ahsoka, that's everyone. The implication is clear enough. I thought you were against spelling things out for the audience. Here's the thing. This is a visual story. As seen in the featurette, Filoni says he wanted to make the most of animation as a visual medium.
And I wanted, since we're animated, we should go a little bit farther.
And on several occasions now, I have shown leniency toward changes made or corners cut because I understand animation is a lot of work. And altering designs, reusing models, etc., those things do not significantly affect the story. But this is the climactic moment in a visual story, and there are no visuals to actually tell the intended story. There is no indication of more time passing. There is no background movement to show other Togruta being ferried to safety. There is no wide shot of a much larger crowd than what was seen in that one cell. These are all ways of implying that more Togruta were rescued than what we were explicitly shown. But we get none of that. There is nothing to show or even suggest that any other cells were emptied before the Jedi rushed to blow up the facility. I'm not inherently against cutting corners, but they cut it too far. Spelling it out is not necessary, but especially in a visual medium, showing it is. Instead, we're just supposed to assume that all the Togruta were evacuated because, well, otherwise the good guys aren't good, are they? We, the audience, must insert information to make the story work properly, because this is intended to be a triumphant end for our heroes, which is made clear not only by the uplifting music playing during the destruction of the facility, but also by the fact that the very next thing we see is the Togruta governor sincerely thanking everyone. Which brings us to this delightful moment.
Ahsoka is the real hero. Without her creativity, I don't think we would have gotten your people to safety.
I will grant that because this version has the floors continue retracting even after the controls were damaged, then the best way to rescue the Togruta was to fly under the facility. But this is another obvious example of the creators going out of their way to focus favor and attention on Ahsoka's character. No one in the comic gave all the praise to Obi-Wan when this was his idea, and rightfully so. They each contributed their blood, sweat, and tears to see this mission through. More so in the comic than in TCW, but still. No single one of them deserves more praise than the others. But the TCW narrative doubles down on it, sweeping the rest of the cast off screen to focus on a conversation between Ahsoka and the governor where he continues praising only her. And the rest of the conversation is equally shallow. For some reason, Ahsoka is confused by the governor's sadness, and so he has to spell out for her that this traumatic experience will haunt the Togruta. To which Ahsoka tritely responds, "Well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger." Note that although the governor refers to them as our people, Ahsoka distances herself by simply referring to them as the people. That, plus the fact that she so easily brushes aside their trauma, further goes to show just how disconnected she is from them and their experience, despite how she claims to understand. But after that, the governor expresses an interest in joining the Republic, which Ahsoka wholeheartedly approves. And that's how the arc ends in the TV adaptation. Spotlight on Ahsoka, the real hero of her people, who are now wisely joining the Republic, the good guys. Let's compare that to the comic ending. Despite everything they'd already been through, Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka stayed on Kadavo to oversee the full evacuation of the Zygerrian facility, both of the freed people and the soon-to-be imprisoned slavers. And as they finally prepare to go home themselves, Obi-Wan takes the opportunity to admit to his former apprentice that he had underestimated the burden Anakin carries, having been a slave for so many years as a child. Kenobi acknowledges that even though he's now had a taste of that experience himself, he still can't imagine what Anakin went through, and he apologizes for how he may have acted dismissively toward that trauma, as well as encouraging Anakin to continue the difficult process of letting go. Anakin assures him that he's trying, and he hopes that someday there will be no more slavery. As I've pointed out several times before, during his time as a slave, TCW Obi-Wan shows far less determination, hope, initiative, etc. than he does in the comics. But the choice to present him that way adds zero thematic or character value, because this moment of him relating to Anakin is completely removed. If TCW had kept this, even a condensed version of it, it would have made all that dejection worth it, because it was building up to something. But instead, all we get is a sad and broken version of a strong and compelling character for no reason. Anyway, just as our heroes are about to destroy the facility and fly off into the sunset, a message comes from Palpatine's office, ordering the facility be kept intact for future use. Ahsoka expresses confusion at the Republic wanting to keep such a facility because it really only has one purpose. Anakin and Obi-Wan agree, and Kenobi, in straight defiance of the Chancellor's instructions, orders Rex to proceed with the demolition. The comic story ends where it began, on Kiros. Once again, the governor speaks with Yoda. After expressing his gratitude, the governor remarks that he must ensure such suffering does not fall on them again. But when Yoda offers to station a Republic garrison on the planet to protect them, he refuses. His people already decided that they would learn to fight for themselves. Their weaponless utopia has been shattered. Life in a galaxy at war requires them to become warriors. I really appreciate how this conclusion leaves space for them to retain their independence while acknowledging that even neutrality comes at a cost, as opposed to the TV version, which frames joining the Republic as the wise choice, which makes for the perfect happy ending. That being said, the creators of TCW at least considered adapting this scene to wrap up the arc, although as usual with alterations, but obviously in the end it was scrapped, so... On the final page of the comic version, we see Anakin and Ahsoka walking together through the city, surrounded by clones helping clean up the wreckage of their opening battle to liberate Kyros. The Padawan asks her master about what the Zygerrian queen had claimed during the auction, that the Jedi were just slaves to the Republic, betraying their beliefs to become warriors for a corrupt Senate. Anakin acknowledges that, like Obi-Wan said, it is true from a certain point of view. Part of being a Jedi means giving up your own freedom to protect the freedom of others. But the important difference is that it's a sacrifice they choose, as opposed to the slaves who are given no choice. With youthful enthusiasm, Ahsoka proclaims that their sacrifice is worth it, and after the war is over, she wants to wipe slavery out of existence across the galaxy. Anakin points out that's a big job, maybe too big. But Ahsoka replies that he's taught her over and over that one person can make all the difference. Swayed by her conviction, Anakin agrees to the plan. And that's the end. I love the juxtaposition of the sad reality facing the Togruta on one page, followed by Ahsoka's lighthearted optimism on the last page. It allows the story to end on a positive note without shrugging off the tragedy that has occurred. Even the detail of showing the clones helping clean up the city quietly reiterates that there is still healing that needs to happen, but there is hope for a better future. I also love what this does for Ahsoka's character and her relationship with Anakin. We get to see her humbly and sincerely seeking his guidance. And although he responds playfully at first, he gets serious when he realizes she is being serious. We also get to see that Ahsoka is actually processing and questioning an opposing viewpoint, trying to reconcile what she witnessed with what she believes, showing that this experience has had an impact on her, something that we've mentioned before is terribly lacking in TCW as a whole. And lastly, we get to see her inspiring her cynical master. She was there when Anakin wished for a day when slavery wouldn't exist, and now she's encouraging him to be a part of making that happen. Even if he's just agreeing to humor her, it's still a really sweet moment. And overall, those three conversations between Obi-Wan and Anakin, the Governor and Yoda, and Ahsoka and Anakin are much deeper and more thought-provoking than what we're given in TCW. It's a great ending to a great story. Okay, let's wrap this up with some final thoughts. It really is a shame to see all the main characters so poorly handled in TCW. I've already spoken of how Ahsoka lost her maturity and agency, how Anakin has been stripped of his decency and dignity, how Obi-Wan is a shadow of his clever and determined self. The one I haven't talked much about is Rex. Since Filoni claims to view him as the co-star of TCW,
in the end, the Clone Wars to me is about Ahsoka and Rex.
One might expect him to receive focus, make some impact. But if you've been paying attention, it should come as no surprise that is not how TCW handles his character. In the comic, he's treated as a supporting character. The narrative doesn't pay much attention to him, but it does give him some moments where he shines. TCW took them all away. On Kyros, in the initial fight, comic Rex deals the last blow to Separatist forces by destroying several tanks with a single shot. In TCW, the narrative showboats Ahsoka defeating the final tank instead. In the comic, Rex also made a brilliant sniper shot to aid Anakin and Ahsoka when they were pinned down. In TCW, the two Jedi solve it on their own. On Zygerria, comic Rex was the first to open fire at the auction, laying down cover for Anakin to release Obi-Wan before Rex joined them in the center of the arena to help fight off the guards. In TCW, he hardly contributes anything before becoming the first to get taken out. Not to mention, TCW Rex also just casually abandoned Kenobi and the Governor after they fell, and doesn't even try to warn Anakin and Ahsoka about Obi-Wan's capture. On Kadavo, comic Rex shows faith in Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan and takes initiative by studying the facility, looking for ways to escape. Aside from helping Kenobi take control of the facility tower, he also gets in a good shot at Ventress. And his final moment in the comic is getting the privilege of destroying the empty slave facility. In TCW, he's just quietly there with Kenobi. Aside from fighting alongside Kenobi in the tower, his only badass moment is when he impales the Keeper in cold blood. Yay? Just like with the others, the opportunities to really showcase Rex's character are there for the taking, but TCW decides to mimic Captain Jack Sparrow instead.
I love those moments. I like to wave at them as they pass by.
And it's the same with Ahsoka's connection to the Togruta. In the first episode, her claim to them is so ham-fisted that it feels like the creators were desperate to shove this theme in there. But then in the second episode, although the opportunity is there, that theme isn't built on. Ahsoka hardly steps into the other Togruta's shoes. She doesn't lose control of her situation the way they have. Rather, she's badly play acting or else comfortably fading into the background. Gone are the scenes of her expressed determination to help her people, her reassuring the governor, or using her knowledge of Togruta royalty to great effect, and the taste of their suffering which she endures as a result. And then in this episode, apart from a single line,
"I'm gonna go help my people,"
she continues acting rather indifferent toward them, but then the governor makes a point of it. Now, to be transparent, in the featurette, Filoni said,
we had gone back and forth about this one too, early on, in fact, you and I, about Ahsoka and these people and how much would she identify with them just because they're Togrutans. Just because they're Togrutans doesn't mean that she would identify with them more than if they were like Twi'leks. Right. I mean, I guess a little more, but she's supposed to be a Jedi.
Which seems to indicate that they did not want to make a big deal of it, but then why repeatedly include it? Why shove it in there only to do nothing with it? It follows a pattern which Alibi and I have previously noted many times about TCW, that the creators place something they seem to want you to remember at only the beginning and or end of an episode or arc. And so, although it is unsupported or outright contradicted by the rest of the content, it sticks in your brain as a point of significance. In the comic, Ahsoka's connection to her people added depth to her characterization. Although she is a Jedi, she is also a Togruta. The narrative strikes the right balance of showing how this connection affects her without it crossing a line into attachment. Also, consider that for Anakin, it's the slavery aspect which makes this mission hit close to home. For Ahsoka, it's the fact that the people in danger are a part of her being. It's why that final shot of the two of them makes for such a great closer. In different ways, for different reasons, Master and Padawan have shared this ordeal, and thus they share a goal of bringing an end to such things. Speaking of the ending, in the featurette, Killian Plunkett suggests to Gilroy that the comic wrapped up too neatly, which Filoni seems to agree with, talking over Gilroy as he attempts to correct the misunderstanding.
You're saying this is the story arc where Anakin becomes a well-adjusted and happy person and everything is fine now?
See.
I mean...
No, absolutely not. Here's the thing, it's like, but
look
even
for Killian in the form.
This seems to indicate that part of the reason the ending was changed was because Filoni didn't want it to look like Anakin had resolved his struggle with his past.
The challenge for us creatively is that, unfortunately, we can never solve any of those problems fully.
But his stance here apparently was not applied to the season 3 finale arc, where Filoni himself describes the ending as,
you know, you see Yoda watching the two of them walking off, and they're very much walking off in a very balanced way, that Anakin had to deal with the loss of Ahsoka and not being able to do anything about it, and then come to the conclusion that the reason that she survived was because of the way that he had taught her, and that would stick with her for the rest of her life.
And
Yoda in the Clone Wars movie is trying to teach Anakin, through giving him a Padawan, to let go of his attachments. And Yoda knows there will come a point in time where Anakin will have to let go of that attachment, where he'll be faced with a situation where Ahsoka will be on her own, as Anakin's mother was on her own. And that there won't be anything Anakin can do to stop what's going to happen to Ahsoka or not. This is that moment. They walk off the landing platform with a different relationship than they had before. Anakin is much more settled.
In both interviews, he justifies the portrayal because, to paraphrase, we all know how Anakin's story ends, so obviously this doesn't affect him in the long run. But that same logic applies to the original comic ending for this Slavers arc. The other reason Filoni gives for why the ending was changed is screen time limitations.
At the end of the comic, the people of Kyros decide that they can't just be an artistic colony. Yeah. They really have to, you just can't stand and avoid the war. You've got to basically learn how to choose a side. Yeah, choose a side.
22 minutes.
As I've been mentioning throughout this comparative study, there's a big issue with how the creators utilize the time they have. There's so much more they could fit in those 22 minutes if they trimmed the fat and layered more moments, as I've explained before. They could add depth without adding time. And honestly, the choice to forego layering most scenes, rather than indicating a depth and maturity which fans of TCW claim the series has, it suggests the priority was shallow banter and flashy spectacle.
What Henry Gilroy brings to the table is that he understands we're going to deliver great action set pieces, so he sets us up for them really well, knowing that we'll get inspired to really make those scenes great.
I understand that as a visual medium, being able to have cool action scenes is one of the strengths of animation, and it's good to want to play to the strengths of the medium you're working with. But, especially in light of what I mentioned earlier about visual storytelling, I consider this comment to be quite revealing of Filoni's mentality. He's implying that the writer's value comes not from constructing a great story, but rather understanding that he's got to just set up action scenes which inspire the team to do a good job. Not only does it indicate where Filoni's priorities lie, it also minimalizes the writer's work and makes the production team sound juvenile, like you have to dangle something shiny for them to get invested in the project. Watching the featurette, it seems clear to me that Gilroy didn't have a lot of say over the adaptation of his comic. There are many indicators that Filoni took control and directed the final product into the mess I've been detailing over the course of this video series. The main reason the story was adapted at all was because of how much Lucas liked it. The comic centered around the characters that Lucas wanted TCW to focus on. It handled some very dark content with depth and nuance while keeping it at a PG rating. And the ending successfully tied up the character themes that had been woven through the story. But then the TV adaptation exchanged depth and nuance for flash and fun, lost several of the themes due to warped characterization or missing content, wasted time at every turn, and capped it all off by making Filoni's OC the focus and presenting her as the real hero of the mission. To me, that speaks volumes as to who was really at the head of this production. However, all that being said, I would be remiss not to mention there are a few good lessons we can learn from the TV adaptation. So, lesson 1, trimming dialogue. If you take the time to compare and contrast the way the dialogue from different scenes was cut and cobbled together for the TV adaptation, it's actually a really interesting study in how to reduce overly wordy scenes. Since most of the time TCW only kept the key lines which were necessary for sensible story progression. If you tend to overwrite, it may help you learn to spot those key lines so that you know what you can let go of. Of course, there is a balance that needs to be struck, as I alluded to. There are moments that TCW went so bare bones that characterization was negatively affected. But when studying the changes, you can experiment by writing alterations which would preserve just enough characterization. On screen is one I did, to see how little I could adopt from the comic to the TCW version to give a bit of characterization back to the Kadavo Keeper and even Obi-Wan. Lesson 2, kill your darlings. This actually kind of encompasses two lessons, rearranging and removing. With rearranging, it can be so easy to become fixated on the idea of a particular event happening in a particular setting, or with particular characters. But the way that TCW switched up the Basilisk commander for a Zygerrian in episode 1, or Ahsoka staying with Anakin in episode 2 so that his interactions with the Queen overlapped with Ahsoka's ruse as merchandise, enabled the creators to streamline their plot. As I've said, they poorly utilized that overlap, but the lesson still remains. We need to remember to be flexible and take a look at areas where we can rearrange story aspects and layer scenes to greater effect, and perhaps improve pacing at the same time. Similarly, when it comes to removing, we must learn how to let go of characters or events. For TCW, it was a necessity to make cuts due to limited screen time and, in the case of Ventress, an altered cast. But for our own work, it could simply be a case of keeping the story focused or efficient. Removing characters entirely, or by combining multiple into one, is a great way to reduce complicated casts with dozens of names. To be clear, a large cast of characters is not inherently a problem. J.R.R. Tolkien, George R.R. Martin, Robert Jordan, and Brandon Sanderson have all proved that a large cast of characters can be used to tell incredible stories. But you'll note that all those authors have penned exceedingly long stories in order to be able to fit all those characters in satisfying ways. So if you want or need your writing to adhere to length limitations, a great way to trim time is to cut or combine characters. And having less characters splitting narrative focus can give you a chance to dig deeper into your remaining cast, preventing characters from just being caricatures. Likewise, removing events can not only cut time, but also again force you to consider how you might rearrange or layer your remaining scenes, since there are often tidbits within otherwise unnecessary scenes which may be worthwhile to keep. The second comic issue provided a more adventurous way for the characters to attain everything they needed to infiltrate the Zygerrian system. But once that all became possible on Kiros by changing the enemy commander to a Zygerrian, that part of the plot became unnecessary. However, the scene where Anakin is impatient and temperamental due to his trauma is an important aspect to keep, so the creators found a way to slot it in elsewhere. As discussed in part 1 and 2, they also found a way to mess it up, but we can still learn from the attempt. Lesson 3, the devil is in the details. With past critiques of TCW, we've had several people accuse us of nitpicking, but I cannot stress enough the importance of details. And I hope I've done a good job of explaining over the course of this video series how small details can make a big difference, such as 1. Squandering time. 5 seconds here, 10 seconds there doesn't seem like much, but it all adds up and can be the difference between including or losing moments that could otherwise strengthen your themes, characters, or plot. Imagine if Ahsoka had a chance to show grief over the destruction on Kiros, or Obi-Wan was given an opportunity to counter the Queen's remarks, or Anakin got to acknowledge his struggle to reconcile with his past. How much more depth those brief moments could have added to the TCW version. 2. Body language.
And don't underestimate the importance of body language.
Something as minute as the timing or lack of a reaction shot can affect a character's development. Showing Ahsoka rolling her eyes after Anakin remarks on the other bombs they need to disarm, or not showing her react with sympathy to him speaking of how his mother was sold into slavery, ends up characterizing her poorly. On the flip side, showing Anakin drawing his sidearm in reaction to the Queen threatening Ahsoka, or Obi-Wan's eyes narrowing in response to the Keeper suggesting he become a good slave, provides insight into what those characters are thinking without them saying a word. Which 3 brings us to dialogue. A seemingly harmless line of banter can take away a character's agency and or dignity and accidentally frame their companions as gross or callous. Or run-of-the-mill banter can be used to set up a meaningful exchange between characters. Just as a feather is light, but enough of them gathered together can weigh a ton, small details can add up and make a big impact on the overall quality of a story. The best stories are the ones that you can return to again and again, finding new details that enrich the experience every time. So remember to pay attention to the finer points of your own story. As you edit and redraft, look for ways you can add small actions or dialogue, layer meaning with symbolism and or subtext, build subtle connections between scenes, etc. Most of TCW's detail work is in its designs, scene compositions, background sets, etc. One example mentioned in the featurette is the screens in the Queen's box at the auction. And of course those things are deserving of credit, but Also, of course, on this channel, our focus is writing. And when it comes to the writing, unfortunately, TCW did not take advantage of details as well as the comic did. But having both versions to compare and contrast gives us the opportunity to learn from what was done well and poorly in either version. And that's all I got. Similar to our rewrites, it goes to show that you can tell the same story, hit the same plot beats, have the same cool moments, but with different setups, different details, different follow-throughs. Same destination, different journey. And as everyone knows, a good journey can make all the difference at the destination. I honestly had a great time with this comparative study, seeing what the arc could have been and even finding some value in how it was adapted. And I hope you've been able to learn something from this exercise as well. If you have, let me know below in the comments and or leave us a thumbs up. If you think this video series is worthy of more attention, please share it around. If you want to help support us making content like this, you can give using super thanks or check out our Patreon, where, as mentioned earlier, we've posted a companion video for this series with exclusive bonus content. As always, we are immensely grateful to our current patrons. You are awesome. Stay loud and proud, folks, and I'll see you around. Even Rex is like still in his armor. They let the man keep his armor. Okay, that makes sense. You should not be treating your audience as stupid. You should not be spelling everything out. There has to be spaces for the audience to fill. But there comes a line where it's like, now you're expecting them to write for you. It's not you've provided all the pieces and they have to put them together. It's you've given them an outline and said, fill it in. Figure it out. The Jedi should die. Die. No. And then a transport shipper. And then a transport. I was like, oh, it's like 5 words. It's gonna be so easy. Just first take. No, because my brain hates me. It handled some very dark content with depth and nuance while keeping it at a... That's the rating, folks.